Okay, so welcome to Violence and the Male Psyche. Over the next 90 minutes, we are going to be doing a deep dive into some research that I've compiled over the last 6 months. So I'm going to share my screen here and just begin with some intentions and a little introduction. So for starters, trigger warning here, we're going to be talking about violence. Um, there's not going to be anything particularly graphic. I'm not asking you to go into your core traumas through this course, but we are going to be talking about potentially triggering information. So with that, please just take care of yourself, and however that looks like for you. The scope of what we're going to be covering today is interpersonal violence. So there are other forms of collective violence like war and systemic oppression, which I'm not going to be going into in this talk. I'm just going to be focusing on what happens between one individual and another individual, or between one individual and themselves. My intentions for sharing this information. So I started doing research on this topic about 6 months ago. I've been writing a book on the archetype of the warrior, part of a men's work series that I've been working on. And one of the questions that has been posed to me is, does it make sense as men to work with this archetype of the warrior, given all of the destruction that warriors have and continue to cause in the world today? And through that exploration, I realized that in the highest form, the most transcendent form of this archetype is the peacemaker. But this is different from being a pacifist and sitting back idly. The peacemaker is required to go into conflict, to the heart of where that violence is happening, to meet it and become intimate with it, to then become an active agent of creating peace in the world. That's the trustable place. So my second bullet here is basically that. It is only through understanding and then experientially meeting my capacity for violence that trustable peace becomes possible. And so these are my intentions going into this material. My other intention for this material, just as a side note, is because I'm writing about a bunch of this information for basically the first time, by getting to present it here, I take myself through another pass of integration with this material, and I get to get some feedback along the way. So if anything that I share here is not clear, please type your questions into the chat and we'll address it along the way. So with that, let's dive right in. I want to start with a definition of violence from the World Health Organization. Violence is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself or against a group or community, that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So this is what most of us and most of the world thinks of when on the concept of violence. It is the intentional causing of harm in oneself or another. And this is a good place to start. I don't think that this is the best definition, and we will get to some more nuance on how I think about violence. But this is the place to start from in conceptualizing and understanding what it is and where it comes from. So then, male violence. When I started doing research, I found statistic after statistic of male violence, and it was pretty eye-opening for me. So here's one statistic. In the context of family and intimate partner relationships, women are considerably more at risk than men. Yet 79% of all homicide victims globally are male. Moreover, some 95% of homicide perpetrators at the global level are also male, a share that is consistent across countries and regions, irrespective of the homicide typology or the weapon used. So who is killing each other on an interpersonal level, not like war or armed conflict and violence, but just person to person. 95% it's men doing the killing. Now, together with this, non-lethal forms of violence are overwhelmingly committed by men, and the recipients of those violence is women and children, which is the first part of the sentence here. Women are considerably more at risk. So there is a question that opens up of what is it about men, about maleness, that is specifically connected to violence. Paul Gilbert, a sociologist on this topic, a cursory look at history shows the enormity of suffering caused by male violence. In the wars, rapes, tortures, and beatings that men have perpetrated on their fellow men, women, and children. Indeed, male violence may even outrank disease and famine as the major source of human suffering. Now, he's not using the Buddhist definition of sources of human suffering, but from a very visceral, gross human survey of what humans are doing to each other, male violence quickly rises to the top of the list as ways that we are harming each other. So this is a big issue. Now, how I organize this information is through what's called integral philosophy, and I look at it through paradigms of consciousness. So I looked at all sorts of different theories in my research. We're going to cover a lot of different theories here. And this framework provides an organization, a structure for how to make sense of all these different theories of why men commit acts of violence. So a little background. A paradigm of consciousness is an organizing framework to interpret the world and oneself. It's basically a worldview. They are held by individuals and by cultures. A paradigm includes the values, morality, mythology, beliefs, assumptions, and identities that one uses to filter and make sense of reality. Integral theory identifies 6 discrete, universal paradigms that individuals may inhabit. So there's not just one paradigm, there are 6 or so. These 6 paradigms form a developmental ladder where each paradigm is a discrete rung. Each successive paradigm is more complex and holistic than the preceding one, so they grow. Societies in human history have advanced through paradigms, and each individual in their natural psychological development moves through paradigms. We go from worldview to worldview. So our paradigm is the lens that we use to interpret reality, and whatever lens we're using is going to make a difference for how we make sense of any topic, including male violence. So let's take a look at these 6 paradigms. And I have the nested Russian dolls here as kind of a visual representation for how they build on each other. Each one transcends but includes the one that comes before. So starting at the bottom, the archaic paradigm is where we all begin at birth. We're kind of just immersed in union with nature and reality. This is where humans were prior to recorded history. During the first couple of years of life, we enter the magic paradigm, also called the tribal paradigm, where we interact with the world and experience ourselves in relationship to the world in kind of a blended, dreamlike way. The world is magical. We live in the anima mundi. The next paradigm is the mythic traditional paradigm, and this is where most of organized religion falls in, and this is the beginning of Western civilization, or civilization like recorded history for humanity. Here, reality is defined by our myths and our traditions. Those are the sources of truth, and they give us the morality and the guidance for how to live a good life. And with that comes the understanding of how to organize into a group of humans larger than a tribal unit where I know everybody by name or kinship. With the beginning, somewhere around the 17th, 16th century became Western civilization emerged into the mental modern paradigm. For most humans, this happens somewhere around teenage years. And this is really the emergence of the egoic rational mind as the center of the self. It uses logic and deductive reasoning and the scientific method to make sense of the world. Since the 1960s, we've had the emergence of the plural or postmodern paradigm. This uses systems level of thinking. So instead of viewing from the egoic individual perspective, we're now looking at emergent phenomenon through complex interactions of networks and systems. Above this is a theorized next paradigm called integral, which sources in wholeness and is connected back into the sacredness of the world. So merging together science and spirituality, connecting back in with the great web of life or Gaia or nature. So in our culture today, the three main paradigms that people view the world through are the mythic traditional, the mental modern, and the plural postmodern. So I'm going to look at how we understand violence through each of these three paradigms. And then after those three, we'll go into the integral view. So starting at the bottom, mythic traditional, there are four parts to how this worldview interprets male violence. And the first is biological reasons. So males have testosterone, and we have measured again and again that testosterone drives aggressive behavior. More testosterone, more likelihood for violence. In addition, male anatomy is larger and stronger than female, so it's better adapted for fighting. And there's some biological know-how that we possess to fight each other. In addition, because women gestate, give birth, and then nurse babies, and they're required during that time period to be kind of in the home taking care of themselves and babies, men are more expendable for life-threatening needs of a group. So these biological drivers have some natural essence of men being the ones who are attuned for violence. Beyond that, there are male instincts, or maybe together with the biology come the instincts. So this is known as the male warrior hypothesis. We hypothesize that an ancestral history of frequent and violent intergroup conflict has shaped the social psychology and behavior of men in particular. Compared with women, men are more likely to engage in intergroup rivalry because for them, the reproductive benefits, for example, in access to mates and prestige gains sometimes outweigh the costs. Indeed, research on traditional societies shows that tribal warfare is almost exclusively the domain of men, and that male warriors have more sexual partners and greater status within their community than other men do. Thus, there is some theoretical and empirical support for the idea that men's behaviors and cognitions are more intergroup oriented than women's. We refer to this idea as the male warrior hypothesis. So men have an instinctual drive to fight. The next piece is called challenge theory. It says that testosterone alone is not enough to really determine aggressive behavior. Rather, aggressive behavior is most likely for males when one, testosterone is heightened, and two, social uncertainty or challenges are present. So challenge plus testosterone leads to aggression. And this isn't just for humans, by the way. We've been able to measure this in male fish, male reptiles, male birds, and male mammals. Final one was a really interesting one for me to discover, which is polygyny, which means the taking by men of multiple wives. So our species' typical sex difference in violent aggression is one which we share with other effectively polygynous mammals. And its link with effective polygyny is well understood. Effective polygyny is a circumstance conducive to the evolution of a male psychology, more combative and risk-prone than that of females. And today, we can measure that in human societies. Here's The Economist. The taking of multiple wives is a feature of life in all of the 20 most unstable countries on the Fragile States Index. So these four traits together kind of kind of point to a male essence of being violent. We have testosterone and anatomy, our biology, together with our instincts in situations of social challenge and in social structures of polygyny that kind of inevitably or naturally lead men to be violent. So, like the female praying mantis who kills and eats her mate, in humans, violence is a natural activity for males. Again, this is through this interpretive lens. Violence is an essential element of maleness. So here's this image that I pulled for the banner for this talk, and this is a rioter from Canada from a decade ago when the Canucks won the Stanley Cup of hockey. So testosterone plus instincts plus social challenge plus rivalry for women leads to violence. Now, there's a lot going on in this image and a lot of larger social factors at play. But for me, it's also pretty apparent to see that, okay, there are some things about maleness. Like, I would not expect to see a woman in this posture, in this position, in a photograph like this. It makes sense to me to see a man here. So, this is one completely valid worldview on where male violence comes from. And while it sheds a lot of light on it, it also kind of leaves us just having to accept that violence is going to be a part of our culture. It doesn't give us an avenue to work on reducing the amount of violence or shifting that in the world today. So now let's move to the next paradigm, which is the mental modern paradigm. Again, in this paradigm, the ego, the egoic self, is the center of the experience. So instead of instincts or the body being what motivates male violence, we're now looking at male violence through how is the ego being influenced. So behavior becomes more of the focus. So male violence is considered to be a behavioral maladaptation of the ego. It's a method of releasing the primal energy of the unconscious due to a lack of control or poor socialization. And so there's studies of violent criminals and what happens in that moment, how they lose control when they commit acts of violence. There's also other longitudinal studies of the types of childhood experiences that violent criminals have had, and violence in the home at a young age leads to violent adults. More on this in a moment. So violent behavior is learned during childhood, and then it's reinforced or even rewarded by society, and then eventually it's reenacted. So from this view, our egoic self is not born violent. We learn it, and that behavior gets kind of internalized in our system and then becomes reenacted. We then take that out as part of a learned behavioral pattern. Okay. So in order to go a little bit deeper on this and understand where this perspective is coming from, I first want to share this slide, which is just in an ideal human society, how different archetypal roles interact, like the life cycle of the human. So we have children, and our job as children is to learn, to play, and to grow. And eventually we develop and we get to a point where we enter into adolescence. The job of adolescence is to self-empower and to socialize. We then move into adulthood, and adults, our job is largely to provide and care for the elders, the children, and the adolescents in society. Yeah, we're earning for ourselves, we're self-actualizing, all of that is important, but we also want to, because we're in the situation of the largest amount of agency, we have responsibility to care for these other sectors. Eventually, we pass into eldership, and elders are really the stewards of culture. They connect with the ancestor realm and the unseen spirit realm, and they help everybody else move through this life cycle. So this is ideally how human society can work, where there are people inhabiting each of these archetypal roles. Now, just because I'm a 40-year-old male adult and I'm biologically an adult doesn't mean that psychologically or archetypally I'll be in an adult self. I know many adult and many children in adults' bodies, many adolescents in adult bodies, right? So the idea is that violence interrupts this cycle. And in this graph, there's a lot of words on it, but this is my attempt to explain how violence interrupts the natural psychological maturation process for human society. So we have children, and the normal kind of round shape that a child would normally have, or organic children, gets impacted by family violence, by peer violence, by community violence, and by institutional violence. We witness violence as children. We experience violence, we become victims of violence, and we also enact violence upon other children. Institutional violence, by the way, an example of this is in America today, we have a mass incarceration of Black adult men. That's a form of institutional violence that impacts children of both genders. So we experience violence as children. This causes trauma, attachment wounding, and an internalization of violence. We take that violent behavior and it becomes part of our psyche. All of these things are pretty rough in and of themselves, but in addition, the archetypal progression becomes blocked. So instead of the child moving on to the adolescent, it leads to a child in an adolescent body, which leads to a child in an adult body. So biologically, we're continuing to grow and age, but psychologically, there's still a frozen, victimized, angry, abused child inside. Children in adult bodies reenact and normalize violence happening to children. I'll say that one more time. Children who are frozen in adult bodies reenact and normalize violence happening to children. So the punchline here is that violence is a behavioral social virus that is propagated through children. It's learned behavior that we pass on and pick up in the very tender and impressionable times when we're young. And then as we become older and we have our own babies, we then pass that forward. Or everybody in our culture, it's not just we, but passes that forward. And then in particular, males are socialized for violence. So instead of the instinctual violence, it's a socialization process. So a central proposition offered to explain the gender gap in delinquency and crime is that males are socialized from an early age to be more physical and to engage in more rough and tumble play than females. In at least one study, males were found to be punished physically more harshly. Aggression amongst boys is reinforced to a greater extent by peers and by those in authority. So we are literally teaching men and boys how to be violent. Okay, so our third frame of reference here is the plural postmodern paradigm. As I said before, this views the world through a systems lens. So we're not looking at an individual egoic actor. We're now seeing that there are emergent behaviors through the systems that interact in society. So from this interpretation, from this paradigm, violence is a social representation. It's a construct that defines a social reality and creates social order. It is inherently a form of power relations. So power relations are actions that influence the actions of others. And in fact, there's not just one social representation of violence, there are three. Male peer violence, so male to male violence. The second is male domestic violence, and the third is female domestic violence. So we're going to look at each of these what causes them, and the power dynamics that are involved in each one. So male peer violence is used to win respect and secure recognition. And this is most common between adolescent and young adult high-risk men. So examples are inner city gangs or bicycle gangs. Violence is used to enter into this community, this group, to win respect and be recognized by other members of the group. And so, in a sense, violence is kind of the price you pay to survive and thrive within a group like this, high-risk men. So this is the vast majority of homicides happen in this type of a scenario. Male domestic violence, on the other hand, has a different social representation. It is the asserting of male dominance, and the term that I like for this is hegemonic masculinity. So here's a quote. Male violence in the home is an instrumental act aimed at asserting or maintaining control. So that's the power relation. Men who beat their wives are most likely to be those who, in terms of marital power structure, personality, sex role adherence, or peer group affiliation, have a particular sensitivity to issues of masculine control. So we use male violence, so we use domestic violence to stay in control, to create order and dominance in the home. And this is carried out against women and children largely. Interestingly, female domestic violence has a different social representation. So there are different studies on this, but if you put all the studies together, it's consistent that about 50% of female domestic violence cases are in self-defense. Loss of control is the motivating factor under increasing stress and diminishing options. So men who kill can be characterized as demanding that the wife do what I tell you to do. Women who kill seem to be saying, I can't take this anymore. Though the result in both cases is equally tragic, these two messages are quite distinct and a predictable result of men and women's differing understanding of aggression. So postmodernity can see that individuals enact violence, but that all violent behavior is situated within the social system that produces it. Therefore, postmodernity is working to deconstruct systems of violence. Here's a French philosopher Foucault. The problem is not changing people's consciousness or what's in their heads, but the political, economic, institutional regime of the production of truth, meaning the social representations. It's not a matter of emancipating truth from every system of power, which would be a chimera, for truth already is power. But, and here's what we're doing here, detaching the power of truth from the forms of hegemony, social, economic, and cultural, within which it operates at the present time. So we're working on a systemic level to change these social representations of what it means to be a man and the power structures between men and women, or men and other groups. Hegemonic masculinity, hegemony means power. So hegemonic masculinity is a term which means a small number of men are holding power over others in a society, a dominator hierarchy. So this is how postmodernity views violence, male violence, is it's part of patriarchy or toxic masculinity. And we're working on a systemic level, social, economic, cultural levels, to change the system of violence. So these are three pretty distinct perspectives on violence. Mythic traditional says that male violence is biological and instinctual. There's a male essence to it. The mental modern paradigm says that violence is learned behavior. And the plural postmodern paradigm sees violence as a social construct and playing out of power relations. Depending on which worldview you're holding, one of these is going to make more sense. The question that I would pose here is, can all of these be true simultaneously? Each act of violence is going to be, in its own way, unique. So we're trying to create theories, broad theories to cover exactly what's happening. So can it be true that in any given act, there may be some biological or instinctual component? There may be some learned behavior, and it may be situated within a system of power relations specific to men and how they relate to other groups. Can all of these be true simultaneously? And can they all influence how, where, and why violence happens in society? I think for me, the answer is yes. But it's also worth noting here that each one of these perspectives on violence is looking outside of my own personal volition. We're looking for why violence is happening based on some type of other factors, whether it's biological or behavioral or social. But what about my choice? What about my free will? Where does my sovereignty fit in? Or are acts of violence just destined to happen in the type of society that we live in today? Is there no way around it? And if I happen to commit an act of violence, am I culpable? Do I have responsibility for that? Or can I just point to my biological, behavioral, and social elements that led me to this act? It's a deep and interesting question. So, where we're going next is into how I may experience violence within myself and how I may or may not be a choice in creating violence towards myself and towards others. And this takes us into the integral framework. So, one of my favorite authors on the topic of violence is Krishnamurti. But those of us who are seriously intentioned can investigate our own lives. We can see how we are violent in daily life, in our speech, in our thoughts, in our actions, in our feelings. And we can be free of that violence, not because of an ideal, not by trying to transform it into nonviolence, but by actually facing it. By merely being aware of it, then when war comes, we shall be able to act truly. So, a deeper understanding of violence takes us into human needs. So, in the middle of the 20th century, psychologist Abraham Maslow created a hierarchy of needs. It's usually depicted as a pyramid. And the hierarchy of needs states that all humans have needs and that we have basic needs that need to get met first. And once we meet those needs, then we can move on to more advanced needs. So they form a hierarchy. So physiological needs are at the bottom, and then safety needs, and then belonging needs, and then esteem needs, and then cognitive needs. Above cognitive, we're no longer in needs, we're now in capacities. Capacity to be aesthetic, the capacity for self-actualization, and the capacity for transcendence. So this is a developmental ladder. Now, humans' conflict needs theory states that each one of these needs can be acted against in its own form of violence, and that when humans don't have their needs met, that creates strong emotions and a really strong drive, which can include the capacity for violence. So violent behavior can be mapped to this hierarchy of needs, like so. So just as there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 types of needs-ish, we can map on a type of violence to each one of these needs. So physical violence largely comes in response to physiological needs and safety needs. Emotional violence, like shaming, humiliation, codependence, exiling, discrimination, addiction, these happen in response to esteem needs and belonging and love needs. Cognitive violence, brainwashing, gaslighting, excessive skepticism and judgment, acts against or in response to a lack of cognitive needs. Aesthetic violence, mess, uncleanliness, vandalism, actualization violence, undercutting, prescribing, devaluing, spiritual violence, spiritual bypassing, spiritual materialism, fundamentalism, and dogmatism. So here we're expanding the definition from what I started us with from the World Health Organization. Violence is physical harm, intentional physical harm. Now I'm saying, okay, there's a whole rainbow spectrum of types of violence with various degrees of the whole spectrum with degrees of gradation. It's not a bright line, this is violent and this is not violent. And it can happen on all different layers and levels. So human needs theory says that needs are universal human traits that motivate behavior. Unmet needs trigger strong adverse emotions like anger, fear, pain, and grief. Violence happens in response to unmet needs and strong emotions. Here's a quote. I love this quote. Needs theories insist that only by satisfying or creating opportunities for individuals to satisfy their basic needs can there exist the possibility of a fully developed human person, a whole human, and a harmonious, progressive society. If needs are satisfied and individuals grow into healthy, multilaterally developed, mature persons, the pursuit of individual good will become the vehicle of social or public good. The claim of needs theories is not simply that the satisfaction of basic human needs ensures the healthy and proper development of the individual. It is also that need satisfaction is, in fact, the only way for the individual to become moral. When I don't have my needs met, I will pursue them, even if that includes violence. So by creating a place where I can have all of my needs met, violence becomes irrelevant. By creating a community where each member has all of their needs met, violence becomes irrelevant. So now we're going to enter into 4 deeper truths about violence, which is my own personal take on how to really get in there on this topic of violence. So this is my original theory here. One is that violence is an act to keep myself or another small. Keeping myself or another small means limiting or moving downward on this Maslow's pyramid of needs. Violence either removes a current need that I already have, it takes it away, or it moves me downward towards more basic needs. Violence also prevents growth to the next higher level. So the effect is that violence keeps whoever's being enacted against small. Second, violence keeps relational systems small. So violence only happens inside relationships. And there will always be a larger relational system that holds the two or more parties involved. So self-violence occurs in the presence of fragmentation or discord between parts of myself. And there's an internal relationship and an internal system of those relationships that's holding the violent act. Because the act of violence keeps at least one actor in the relational system small, the integral view can see that violence inherently limits the capacities of the relational system holding the actors. So even though there may be some fleeting sense of victory, some one-upsmanship that I have when I commit an act of violence towards someone else, that I have bested them or gotten something, the relational system is limited and moves downward because of that act of violence. So it's like we're in this bubble together, and I'm trying to move up by pushing you down, and that discord moves the whole bubble further downward. Violence keeps relational systems small. Number 3, every external act of violence is a consequence of internally self-inflicted violence. And this is maybe the most subtle, and this one took me the longest time to find in my own internal explorations. But basically, I will only enact violence upon others to the extent that I am already experiencing violence within my psyche. And put it another way, if when I was a kid, I received some act of violence towards me, I got hurt by somebody, sometimes I will pass that along and reenact that towards other people, right? That happens because that act of violence I internalize, and that is now cycling, happening in my internal psyche. And then I do it to somebody else. Sometimes somebody hurts me, and then I never reenact that hurt. I never carry it forward because I didn't internalize that violent behavior. So if I'm not in a state of violence inside of myself, I will not commit an act of violence externally in the world. Every external act of violence is a consequence of internally self-inflicted violence. And this is really where the responsibility and the ownership starts to land. Here's the 14th Dalai Lama. I love this quote too. Although attempting to bring about world peace through internal transformation of individuals is difficult, it is the only way. It is only by working with the internal violence, conflict, cruelty that each one of us experiences in our psyche, only through that we will bring peace into the world. So on the left-hand side, I have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then on the right-hand side, I did some brainstorming and thought of all the different ways that I would have been or could be violent to myself. So this is what I do to me. And this is not obviously exhaustive. You may have your own unique and exquisite ways of being violent to yourself. But looking through this list, I am constantly and in many, many different ways, consciously and unconsciously, undercutting my needs, acting against my own self-interest, my own highest good. I have these habits, these patterns of self-violence, of self-cruelty. And it is by meeting these places in myself that I can come to the true and trustable place of peace. So, number 4, my self-violence is always a choice I make. It's my choice. The choice may be habitual. I may have been doing this my entire life. The choice may be because my dad did something to me when I was younger, or because XYZ happened when I was a little kid. Okay, that event happened when I was a little kid, but now, today, the self-violence that I'm experiencing is my choice. I'm continuing to propagate it. It may be subconscious. I may not even be fully aware of what I'm doing. So, on some layer or level of my being, I am choosing this, even if it's not my adult self. So, where this leads me is to be honest about how I hurt myself, to accept that I am cruel to myself, to own it, say, I do this, and then to feel how it is that I habitually or unconsciously or even consciously hurt myself, and the hurting or the pain or the disgust or the dark pleasure that comes with that. And this is, for me, the process of becoming intimate with my own violence. And when I'm here, whatever anybody else is doing, I can find that I have that same capacity within myself. And that opens the door to compassion. That opens the door to bring more love in. That opens the door to, instead of condemn, to embrace and to make the world meaningfully more peaceful. This part here, not easy, not easy at all. Being honest, owning, and then feeling. It's warrior's work. Uh, Don Miguel Ruiz, from the author of the Four Agreements. Humans punish themselves endlessly for not being what they believe they should be. They become very self-abusive, and then they use other people to abuse themselves as well. But nobody abuses us more than we abuse ourselves. And it is the judge, the victim, and the belief system that make us do it. True, we find people who say their husband or their wife or mother or father abused them. But you know that we abuse ourselves much more than that. The way we judge ourselves is the worst judge that ever existed. So these are my 4 deeper truths about violence. Violence is an act to keep myself or another small. Violence keeps relational systems small. Every external act of violence is a consequence of internally self-inflicted violence. And my self-violence is always a choice I make. These 4 deeper truths are like a staircase, and you can take any act that you see in the world or that you find in yourself and go through this process to get to the core, to become intimate with that violence. And so this process here, for me, is where I see real transformation happening for individuals. And then as each individual makes this intimate connection, then that starts to ripple out into the world. So there's a famous quote from Mother Teresa. An interviewer was asking her what motivated her for the very powerful and dedicated acts of charity work that she had committed her life to. And she said that her charity work began the day that she discovered she had a Hitler inside of her. And that discovery motivated this amazing, like astounding level of service work, truly change the lives and reduce the amount of suffering in the world. Final quote here. For a person to experience well-being means that person has appropriate satisfiers for the human identity needs of meaning, connectedness, action, security, recognition, and the like, and that these are well integrated around a high level of selfness. So this is looping it back around to human needs theory. What we're working on here is moving from systems of violence to systems of well-being, to virtuous processes where we're lifting ourselves and each other up. And whereas violence makes myself or another small and keeps relational systems small, what we want to work towards is well-being, or in Redekop's terms, blessing. We want to bless each other. And by blessing each other, we lift each other up so that we are all having our needs met. And all of our needs are integrated around a high level of selfness, meaning each one of us as an individual can feel our center, our core, and we can organize all of our needs getting met around the agency of self-center. This is true for individuals, but it's also true for social groups, for cultures. Cultures need to have a sense of self, and they need to have their needs met. What happens for collective forms of violence are vastly different mechanisms. So war, systemic oppression, things like that, they happen differently, but we're all individual humans participating in these larger systems. So if we get the individual humaning figured out, then the larger systems will also figure themselves out. So that is my presentation. Thank you for those of you who joined me. I will open it up here if there are comments or questions to have a little discussion.